It's a time in our service where we collect an offering. To those attending MCC Boston through social media, you too can participate by going to our website at mccboston.org and clicking on the donate button there for that purpose. Thank you for being a part of our church family. Members and friends of MCC Boston, as many of you know, our church is presently conducting a stewardship drive. This year's drive is titled Doing My Part. It's a reminder that each and every one of us has a role to play in the ongoing success and forward momentum of our church and its ministries which connect us to our Creator, to one another, and to the community beyond our doors. Once again, we have great news to share. So far, 6 individuals or families have pledged a total of $10,780. Thank you to all who have completed your pledge card and have helped our ministry budget and income planning for 2024. As a way of demonstrating our progress each week, we've been updating our rainbow graphic by coloring the area up to the amount previously pledged. Also, as is our custom here at MCC Boston, we'll be highlighting colors of the rainbow each week with a story that emphasizes aspects of stewardship. This evening, our color is yellow. Yellow is the most luminous of all colors of the spectrum. It's the color that captures our attention more than any other color. In the natural world, yellow is the color of sunflowers and daffodils, lemons, canaries, and bees. Symbolically, yellow is the color of happiness and optimism, of enlightenment and creativity, sunshine and spring. Yellow also symbolizes light, which in itself is often used as a metaphor for God. Yellow also reminds us of a stewardship because it both draws our attention and lights our way to see the beauty of God's creation. Sunshine, creativity, happiness, these are all gifts from a loving Creator. As Christians, we are called to be good stewards of all of God's gifts and to use them to better the lives of all humanity. Jesus underscored this truth in his parable of the talents in Matthew 25:14. It's the story of a master who entrusts his servants with the responsibility of managing his property while he is going on a trip. When he returns, he asks them for an accounting. The message of the parable is to be a faithful and trusted servant of God and to use God's gifts in a way that is pleasing to God. As we look to our rainbow graphic, we can see that we're making good progress in achieving our goal. Our pledge drive is continuing for one more week, so it's not too late to submit your pledge form. You'll find a form conveniently located on this evening's table, and you'll know that no amount is too small, for every pledge will help in funding our ministries. This year's pledge drive, Doing My Part, is a reminder that each of us has a very personal role to play in the ministries of this church and our denomination. Your investment in MCC Boston enables you to be a faithful and trusted steward. So this week, please prayerfully consider making a pledge of support to MCC Boston. For now, as the basket is presented, please give.
Our first reading comes from the book of Amos, chapter 5, from the Inclusive Bible and the Message. Woe to all of you who want God's judgment day. Why would you want to see God, want God to come? When God comes, it will be bad news before it's good news. The worst of times, not the best of times. It'll be like running from a lion only to meet a bear. Or like getting home safe at last only to get bitten by a snake hiding in the corner. At God's coming, we face hard reality, not fantasy. A black cloud with no silver lining. It will be gloom without a single ray of light. I can't stand your religious meetings. I'm fed up with your conferences and conventions. I want nothing to do with your religion projects, your pretentious slogans and goals. I'm sick of your fundraising schemes, your public relations and image making. I've had all that I can take of your noisy ego music. When was the last time you sang to me? Do you know what I want? I want justice, oceans of it. I want fairness, rivers of it. That's what I want. That's all I want.
Our second reading is from the Gospel of Matthew, the 25th chapter. God's realm is like 10 young virgins who took oil lamps and went out to greet the bridegroom. 5 were silly and 5 were smart. The silly virgins took lamps, but no extra oil. The smart virgins took jars of oil to feed their lamps. The bridegroom did not show up when they expected him, and they all fell asleep. In the middle of the night, someone yelled out, "He's here! The bridegroom's here! Go out and greet him!" The 10 virgins got up and got their lamps ready. The silly virgins said to the smart ones, "Our lamps are going out. Lend us some of your oil." They answered, "There might not be enough to go around. Go buy your own." They did, but while they were out buying oil, the bridegroom arrived. When everyone who was there to greet him had gone into the wedding feast, the door was locked. Much later, the other virgins, the silly ones, showed up and knocked on the door, saying, "Master, we're here. Let us in." He answered, "Do I know you? I don't think I know you. So stay awake, for you don't know the day or the hour."
So today's passage about the 10 wise and foolish maidens makes me think of a well-known subreddit, commonly abbreviated to AITA, which stands for Am I the, and the last word there is a particular anatomical feature, commonly associated with people who are cruel or rude or otherwise unpleasant. The idea is that people will go online and share a personal situation that they are a part of in order to ask random strangers on the internet if they were the anatomical feature in this situation, or if they were right and someone else involved was the anatomical feature. It's a way of gauging the morality of one's own actions by appealing to others who don't have any personal stakes in the situation. And I bring this up because, first of all, wedding anecdotes are just such a common feature of this particular subreddit, and I was already primed to think about it. But also, I have a hard time reading this story without thinking that the bridegroom, who is clearly a stand-in for Jesus, is kind of being an anatomical feature here. I mean, I know the maidens in question were foolish in this situation, but I don't think they were foolish enough to think that they were a part of this wedding when in reality the bridegroom doesn't know them at all. And sure, it wasn't ideal for them to come to the wedding without enough oil to light their lamps after the long wait. But I think they can hardly be blamed for expecting the bridegroom to show up to his own wedding sometime before midnight. And then they go through the whole ordeal of finding someone who can sell them oil in the middle of the night, just to find out that not only are they uninvited from the wedding, but the bridegroom is also completely disowning them. It also bears saying that in this context, weddings were a public affair. You weren't actually expected to know the bride or groom to join in on the celebration. Traditionally, the celebration was open to all. Even having a wedding with closed doors would have been unusual. I'll be the first to say the foolish maidens messed up, but I hardly think their mistake is worth completely excluding them from the wedding. But of course, that's not really the point of the story. I always struggle with allegorical stories like this because the situation in reality doesn't always perfectly correspond to the symbolic situation in the story. As common wisdom has it, all analogies limp, so it's unrealistic to expect every allegory to make complete sense in a vacuum. Allegories aren't meant to have flawless internal logic. They're meant to shed new light on reality. So sure, maybe the bridegroom is being a total anatomical feature here, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the figure he represents is guilty of the same. Nor is the mistake of the foolish maidens necessarily the same small understanding that we see here. These things are all symbolic, and symbols don't always add up the same way their real-life counterparts do. But the other thing is, I don't particularly like the people the wise maidens represent either. I mean, this story is at its heart about apocalypse, about being prepared for the coming of Christ and the new world he is bringing with him. And while it's great in the story for the wise maidens to be prepared for the apocalypse, I find that people in reality who are always planning ahead for the apocalypse are tedious and small-minded and hard to have conversations with. Doomsday preppers stocking up their bomb shelters waiting for martial law. Street corner preachers getting all hot and bothered about their fantasies of the world drowning in its own wickedness. Not to mention certain United States religious movements funding certain foreign nations, enacting certain acts of genocide and settler colonialism because they believe the reestablishment of this certain foreign nation will hasten the revelation. If these are the people the wise maidens stand for, then I'm not a fan, honestly. An important thing to know about apocalypse is that historically apocalyptic discourse rises with the hardship that people live through. People and cultures who are suffering are more likely to embrace apocalypticism, which is understandable in its way. These same people often believe that the apocalypse will bring an end to suffering, that it will enact a new reality in which the troubles that plague them have disappeared. The hungry dream of a new world in which food is plentiful. The homeless dream of a new world in which shelter is readily available and people are treated with dignity. The war-torn dream of a new world in which peace reigns over all and there is no need for violence. And all of these people can be justified in dreaming of the end of a world which causes them to suffer so deeply, and the coming of a new world in which their problems are solved. I myself have had those moments where the pain of the world feels unsustainable, where it feels as if things must be coming to an end, because I can't imagine how they can continue dragging on with all this suffering. But in spite of the apocalyptic fantasy, the suffering don't typically plan to bring the apocalypse forward, because I think they understand that there will be a great increase of suffering just before everything comes to an end. Or as Amos had it in the inclusive text today, there'll be bad news before there is good news. And for these compassionate people, even the ultimate end of all suffering doesn't justify bringing more suffering to others in the present moment. The apocalypse is a dream of better, but with a cost. And they are often content to wait for that cost to be paid in its own time. But those who thirst for the apocalypse, I don't think they're dreaming of a world without suffering. I don't even think that's the draw of apocalypse for them. I think they are salivating over the suffering of others that comes just before the world without suffering. And I think they are dreaming of a world without suffering that they can exclude others from. I think these people dream of apocalypse in the same way that I win imaginary arguments in the shower. The appeal isn't the solution to all the world's problems, the end of all suffering. The appeal is in their own vindication. The doomsday prepper dreams of the day when everyone will see that he was right to be prepared. The apocalyptic street corner preacher revels in the thought that everyone who doesn't heed his warning will suffer and be expelled from the perfect world that he will be a part of. The evangelical dreams of the day when God will stamp her seal of approval on their theology to the exclusion of all others. They're really all preparing for their own private little apocalypse, one which will cater to them exclusively and vindicate all of their actions and beliefs to the exclusion of those who ever dared defy them. And I don't particularly care for those people. The prophet Amos also didn't particularly care for those people. In his day, Amos was troubled by those who believed that the northern kingdom of Israel could do no wrong. He spoke to those who believed that the coming of God could only mean the salvation of the kingdom and the destruction of all those who stood against them. Amos addressed those who believed that the God of all creation existed only to vindicate them as God's chosen people. And Amos himself was of the same faith. It's not that he denied that the Israelites were God's chosen people. But from his perspective, the kingdom of Israel had forgotten that being God's chosen was a covenant with responsibilities on both sides. God's covenant to bless and protect the kingdom was contingent on the kingdom's responsibility to worship God, not only through word but through deed. Amos believed that God would not defend Israel if Israel continued to sow corruption and injustice, to neglect the needs of the poor, to cheat the day laborer out of a fair wage, to allow those in power to fatten themselves up on food that belonged to the hungry. Amos's contention with the northern kingdom wasn't necessarily that they were mistaken in believing God shielded and protect them, but rather that they had forgotten that God also required of them justice and mercy, care for the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner. So when Amos scolded them for desiring the day of God, the issue wasn't that they were dreaming of God's intervention. The issue was that they believed God would always intervene on their behalf, no matter how much they neglected their responsibilities to God. Of course, they thought they were fulfilling their responsibilities to God by praising and worshiping. But they did not realize that God does not care for worship in the mouth that is not backed up by worship in the heart, that is sincere caring for those neglected and oppressed, that is not backed up by worship of the hands that is work to build up the poor, the stranger, the suffering in their midst. And as is the way with prophets, Amos spoke truth and it went unheeded. The kingdom of Israel continued in its neglect of justice and mercy until the Assyrians destroyed them. And that same attitude is much of what troubles me with this text. It appears to vindicate those who yearn for an apocalypse that exists only to save themselves and those who they care about. It seems to reward those obsessed with apocalypse and scold those who did not yearn for the day of God. Except that upon closer reading, I think this story actually does the opposite. Yes, the wise maidens were prepared for the coming of the bridegroom, and yes, the foolish maidens were unprepared. But the preparedness was not determined in the arrival. The foolish maidens would have had oil enough if the bridegroom hadn't been so delayed. The wise maidens were ready for the coming of the bridegroom because they had planned ahead for a long wait. Because they were wise enough to know that the coming of the bridegroom might not happen exactly as they had imagined it. Their preparedness was the direct result of their willingness to wait, their humility in believing that the bridegroom would come when he was ready. And it was their responsibility to be prepared for whatever time he would finally arrive. It was the foolish maidens who were thirsty for apocalypse. They were the ones who were so eager to greet the coming bridegroom that they assumed it would happen the instant they desired it. They were the ones who were unprepared precisely because they didn't prepare for a long wait. They were prepared for their own private little apocalypse, the one they had imagined. The bridegroom coming exactly when they expected and telling them they'd done everything right. But they weren't prepared for the actual coming of the bridegroom because the bridegroom did not conform himself to their expectations. He came when he was ready. There is that sort of paradox to apocalypticism because the way to genuinely prepare for the coming of God is by caring for the world during the wait. Eternal vigilance sounds great in theory, but the wise maidens fell asleep just as the foolish ones did. The difference was that they prepared for a long wait. And those who are thirsty for apocalypse don't have all that much reason to work while they wait. Why sow justice and mercy in a world that's going to end any day now? Why bother feeding the hungry and clothing the naked when there could be only a few days left for them to prepare for the revelation by accepting Christ? Why bother building up a world that will need to be paved over for the coming of God's reign? But the service to the oppressed, the advocacy of justice, the building up of a world that cares for its people, this is exactly how one prepares for the day of God. Amos saw that. He saw that the kingdom of Israel would need to be just and righteous to depend on God to save them from their conquerors. In the end, one prepares by considering the world that Christ brings with him. Those thirsting for the end are already prepared for their private little apocalypse they picture in their head. Because in order to survive that apocalypse, they don't need to do anything to change themselves. The whole point of that apocalypse is vindicating who they already are. But those who wish to prepare for the real coming of Christ into the world must do so by considering the world Christ will build. And Jesus told us many times how to do that. We prepare by caring for the poor, the orphan, the widow. We prepare by humbling ourselves in service to others. We prepare by loving God with all that we have and by loving our neighbors as ourselves. We prepare by making peace because that's the world Christ is bringing. One in which people care for one another. One in which our relationships with one another and the community we build is more important than any one of us being right or wrong. One in which people's needs are met because there are so many people around who have practiced meeting the needs of others. I hate when I lose my place. If we want to prepare for the world that is coming, we must first realize that the world that is coming doesn't exist only to satisfy our own fancies, to vindicate us in the face of our naysayers. We must prepare not for our own private apocalypses, but for a world that will care for all of its people. And that's a weighty task. And we're going to get that wrong a lot of the time. And it will probably take time to really learn how to live into the world that is coming. But as it turns out, we seem to have plenty of opportunity to work on that while we wait. Thank you.